Okay, we are live.
Perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good middle of the night, wherever you are in the world. I'm Laura Janusik, and on behalf of the International Listening Association, I would like to welcome you to our first quarter webinar in the 2018 series. I'm really excited about today's webinar because we have a guest, Kathy O'Brien, whom I met at an ILA conference probably within the last 5 years. I think it was about 5 years ago. And she just touched me so much from the moment I met her, and I'm fascinated by her story, and I think you're going to be fascinated as well. Before we get into that, let's kind of give you some of the rules of the road today. So our topic today is listening beyond boundaries, and that will make much more sense once Kathy introduces herself in a second. Some tips, Phil, if you would like to take over on this part.
Sure, thank you. In order to reduce the possibility of feedback, I'm going to mute all microphones so background noise is eliminated. If you want to communicate with us or have a question, use the chat feature, because I'll also be monitoring the entire the chat during the entire thing. It is located on the bottom of the screen, or for some people it might be on the side or the top of the screen, and you can see it's like a little comment balloon there. So please make use of that. If you do not want to be seen on screen, you have control over turning your camera on or off, but we like to see everybody. So enjoy. At the end of the meeting, this is far down the road here. To disconnect, all you have to do is click on End Meeting. And just one other note. In the event that you might notice that you might have frozen on the screen, that usually is a temporary internet instability. And if you can't, if that happens, it doesn't happen that often, the best thing to do is just disconnect, and then you can immediately reconnect. So enjoy our time together, and I'll give this back to Laura.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil. So a few introductions here. I'm Laura Janusik. I am here in Kansas City, Missouri at Rockhurst University, where I'm a professor of communications. I'm also a consultant, and my research areas are listening cognitions, listening metacognitions, and pedagogy. I've been an ILA member since 1998, and I was president from 2010 to 2011. And as a matter of fact, I'm a life member, so I am going to be a member for life. And then we have Phil. I'm going to let Phil introduce himself, but he is our technological moderator and guru. Phil?
Hi, thanks, Laura, and welcome everybody again. I'm an instructor of communication studies at Northern Virginia Community College, one of the largest community colleges in the United States. I'm also a Virginia master teacher, and my specialty area is listening and student success. Like Laura, I also am a lifetime member, and I was the ILA president in 2015 and 2016.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Phil. And then we have Kathy O'Brien. And Kathy is the managing director of Red Shoes Communication, and she actually comes to us today by way of Singapore. So Kathy, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you introduce the rest of this impressive resume that you have up here.
Thank you, Laura, and I'm so happy to be with everyone. I am an American who has been lucky enough to live outside the US for most of my adult life. The last 21 years I've spent in Singapore. Like a lot of expatriates, I came to Singapore thinking I'd stay for a couple of years, just see what it was like. Loved it, found it a very, very welcoming community, and have stayed, and I'm raising my kids here. And prior to here, I lived in the UK twice, New York a couple of times, which some would say is also a foreign country if you grew up somewhere else in the US. But I'm originally from Boston. So in my work now, Red Shoe is a company that coaches and trains executives in communication skills. For example, preparing for presentations, negotiations, media interviews. And I also teach once a year. I'm a visiting professor at Sasin, which is the MBA school of Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. So that gives me some really nice exposure too. From Singapore, I do work in most Asian markets. So that's helped to give me some really, really thoughtful insights that I hope will give us a starting point for today's discussion.
Absolutely. And Kathy, I had a question for you, actually, in terms of Red Shoe Communications. When you do your coaching, is it coaching for English, or you coach in other languages as well?
Great question. I wish we could say that we do it in multiple languages. In the team, many languages are spoken: Mandarin, Bahasa, Thai, etc. But in our work, we do it in English because we find that in Asia, the big demand really is for executives who may already be very proficient in their own language, but they are now forced into a business environment where they're having to do it all, do this, really the spotlight communications in English. So we're working in English all the time.
That makes perfect sense. And Kathy, I have to say that I'm very excited because I know I get to see you in just a few months because we are going to be meeting in Ireland.
Yes.
Right.
Can I say a little bit about that, Laura?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, great. Thank you. So, folks, ILA, the International Listening Association, has a convention once a year. We usually go to the U.S. about, Laura, would it be, say, 3 out of 4, and we go outside the U.S. 1 out of 4?
1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5. Depends on the time frame.
Okay, great. So this year, it's being hosted in Dublin. This is the one conference of the many that I look at every year that is most important to me. We were talking about this. If any of you were dialed in early, you could hear us saying that ILA to me is really like a family of people who are all coming out listening through different routes and with different motivations, and yet somehow have this wonderful sharing. I learn so much every time I go. Some of you who are on the call now have led workshops I've gone to where I've learned about listening for empathy in a spiritual setting, for political reasons that have nothing particular to do with the work I'm doing, which is more about listening in a business context, but it so opens up my mind and enlightens what I do too. So to all of you, I would say join us in Dublin. It really is a very, very rich dip into a very special area that's a treat for me once a year.
Yeah, it very much is. And actually, on this call today is also Jenny Grau. And a huge shout out to Jenny Grau because she is planning this conference from the United States. And in looking at the preliminary program, I can tell you that she has done a phenomenal job of putting that together. And we're going to have very rich experiences. And for those of you who are academics, what I love about ILA is it's not just all academics. We have people from all walks of life, as Kathy was saying. And so it's just really mind-opening to see how people come at listening very differently. So that said, Kathy, we are going to be coming at listening today from Listening Beyond Boundaries. So why don't you tell us a little bit about today's format?
Yes, I'd love to. So, folks, I'm suggesting in today's call some ways we might think about how we listen across boundaries. I'm even going to suggest what I mean by these boundaries, what boundaries might be. Why is it when I listen to you that there might be a boundary I've got to get over? Why is it when you listen to me, there might be something that makes the listening more challenging? And frankly, that list is a long one. So I'm just going to put out a few ways that I tend to think about it and give you some examples to get us going. But what I really want is for this call to be a lot of sharing. So Phil, I might pause to you for a second to talk about that, to make sure people are comfortable with how they share, because that really is what we love from all of you. So Phil, how best could people share in this conversation?
Absolutely. If any of you have a particular question or want to get into the conversation, just send us a chat, and I can unmute the microphones when necessary. You also have control over your microphone. There is a mute button, which would be on the far left, but we like to keep it into control and not have everybody muted. So if you have a question, please feel free to jump in.
Perfect. Thank you. Kathy, back to you then.
Okay, thanks, Phil. And similarly, I'll ask you to contribute sometimes. So I'll give you warnings and tell you what it is I'd like you to think about, and would really love to hear some input. So folks, when we think about listening, if you just pause on that word for a moment, it's something that we do throughout our days, or at least we say we do it. And yet, I find in every conversation I have, when we really pause and think about listening, most people will say to me, oh, I'm not a good listener, or I know I don't listen as much as I should, or I'm really not sure, how well I'm doing with listening, or my wife tells me I'm not a very good listener, or my husband tells me I'm not a very good listener. So it's so interesting that on the one hand, it's core in our lives. And yet on the other hand, many of us are quick to say, I don't think I'm doing this very well. So I like to think about this in two ways. And perhaps, Laura, we could put up the slides for a moment just for these two contexts I'd like all of us to think about.
Sure.
So one would be, how do we use our listening skills and strategies when we are listeners ourselves? So to all of you, I would say, think about how you are when you're a listener. When you are, when someone's got something important they want to talk about. Yeah, I'd say that one that you're pointing to now, Laura, listening to cross boundaries.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you think of yourself as a listener, and you're listening to someone else who maybe has something different from you, whose background, style, behavior, language, could be anything, is different from yours, then how can you listen better to them? But that might be the one you already thought about before you came onto this call. Here's another one I'd like you to think about. When you are speaking to someone who might be different from yourself, what do you want to know? What is it useful for you to know to help you be a better, more effective speaker to them? What can you do when you speak to help them listen better? So I'd like to suggest that we take responsibility for both. And let's pause for, as we go through some ideas for thinking about it, I'd ask you to keep in mind both of these. I'll remind you of both, but keep in mind both how you are as a listener, but also how you are as a speaker. And I'd love you to just think of what do these ideas remind you of in your own brain, and what would you like to share with us? So if we just go on perhaps one slide more, and then I promise you we don't need too many slides here today. The differences among us are so countless. If you think about yourself in a conversation with any other person at all, you and that person might have a different ethnic or national culture. That's probably one you thought about before you came on this call, because we've set it up that way, saying that listening across culture has its own challenges. But what about family and socialization? What has that done to the way you listen? What are the habits that you grew up with now do to you as a listener? There's already been a lot written about listening across gender. This is a very hot topic nowadays. I'd love to talk about that one a bit. But also context and expectations. Pause for a moment and think about the context of the business environment. Say, how do you listen when you're in business versus how do you listen when you're child tells you about his day, or when a friend has an issue that they need a shoulder for? Do we listen differently? And then I love to put this one up to perception of yourself in the context. So we receive ourselves differently in different contexts. What is my role in this conversation? And how does that affect the way I listen? Now, these 5 layers are only a small portion of the many different filters, frankly, in our listening ability. As we listen, we are listening through the filters of our experience, of all of these many factors that have come to bear on who we are, and many more. So start thinking about that. See what it's reminding you of in your life, and then let's just unpack the layers of it. Let's take them piece by piece, see what we think about these topics. What can we learn from each other? What questions do you have that maybe Laura and Phil and I could help answer from our experience, and see where it takes us. So let's take the first one. Maybe, Laura, we could just go to the some example slide that says ethnic and national culture for a second. And I'll remind you of that first bullet point I gave you folks. So what do we mean by ethnic and national culture? Sorry, little bit here. Nowadays, it's impossible to work in any environment and be monocultural. Wherever you are, you're working with people who've come from a different place, who may speak a different language as their first language or their home language, who were given a different set of norms as they were growing up. So let me just toss out a couple of examples, and then I'd love you, even now as you're starting to think of examples, send Phil a message if you'd like to offer up something. Either type the example there and we can just put it out there for you, or let us know if you'd like to speak. So when I first came to Asia, I was so surprised if I was in a situation where someone in a little more authority was speaking and the other person was listening, say with someone who worked for me on my team. As I would speak to that person, the eyes would be down. Eye contact would be down. There'd be no eye contact with me as I was speaking. There'd be this, just this looking down, almost I was really only getting the eyelid. Now, as an American, this struck me as really surprising. If anything, I even felt a bit like it wasn't very respectful, because I was raised with the look at me while I'm speaking to you style. That's what my parents would always say. Looking at someone, making eye contact was a sign of respect. I'm focused, I'm paying attention to you. A physical attribute that said I was listening. By the way, it doesn't necessarily mean I was listening, but that is what we were taught. In Asia, it's in many Asian cultures, but I'd love to hear from those in Asia now about your own experience. It's quite the opposite. Showing respect is looking down. Looking up could be seen as rude. You don't have the right to look up. The elder should get more deference. So think of how that affects you, because initially here for me, I was feeling a bit not respected, wondering why this person wouldn't look at me. By the way, very often you'll find in these sort of settings, the person won't say anything either, because that's just what they've learned. You don't speak, you just take it in. Whereas in the culture I was raised, you must say something. You must show that you have a response. You must indicate that you've heard it. So visual clues here made quite a difference to me in listening, and understanding that there was a background, there was an upbringing, helped me to understand people I was working with. So what about the rest of you? What have you experienced? What other examples have you noticed when you've dealt with someone from a different culture that affect the way they listen to you or you listen to them, or have made you adjust the way you speak to them? Would anyone like to offer up something? Phil, I wonder if we have any indications on the, I think Jenny would like to say something.
Sure. I grew up in that other country you called New York City. And I do concur, though, it is sometimes a world of its own. And in a family that was very vocal and demonstrative, and I married a man who grew up in the middle part of the United States in a more quiet expectation around vocal expression. And early in our relationship, we learned that what we thought was yelling was very different. So how loud is too loud? He would say things like, why are you shouting at me? His listening expectation of what my vocal sound should be was much, much softer. I said, I'm not shouting, I'm excited. I said, if you really want to know what shouting is like, I can show you. So I've learned not only in interactions with him, but also now since I make my living as a business consultant in this part of the country, I often am more soft-spoken. I also try to slow down quite a bit, and I am more mindful of noticing what the norm in the room is before I contribute to it, because it's not always my instinctive, intuitive New York experience.
Wow. Thank you, Jenny. How interesting. Has your husband noticed?
Well, it's been almost 30 years, so I'm hoping he has. But he's not here to ask at the moment.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I can relate to that as well, being
Thanks,
from
sir.
New Jersey. We talk fast, we talk loud. It seems like we're fighting sometimes and shouting, but we're really not. But it frames the expectations that others have from different parts of the country, as Jenny mentioned.
Yes, and I noticed, Laura here, so I noticed that when I was on the East Coast, time was very important, and so people often interrupted each other, and that wasn't seen as rude. It was seen as a way to get the conversation done because you had to get on to your next conversation. And then when I moved to the Midwest, that is just a huge no-no here. You do not interrupt people while they're speaking. And so it was always funny for me, supposedly being a listening, professional, interrupting people, and they, it took away a lot of credibility in the beginning. And it's still very hard for me to bite my tongue because I still am wired, I think, more to interrupt at times.
Fascinating. Yeah. I was with a client just on Monday who was exploring some issues around behavior in meetings. And something very linked to this came up, Laura, and there was an insight we looked at that might be useful for folks to hear about. So you'll see later in the slides that we recommend one of the big researchers in culture, whose name is Jutta Hofstede, who is a Dutch psychologist who did very extensive surveys in the 1960s of culture and organizations. He looked at the different national cultures in 60 different countries, but for the same one organization, and made some interesting comparisons. So there's one category that Hofstede spoke about that my colleagues on in the ILA are very familiar with, which is collectivism versus individualism. And this has a very interesting effect on listening. And for this client I was talking to on Monday, this was a huge aha for her. She's Asian, and she's very much at the end of the spectrum, the collectivist end. So if you have a collectivist background, you have come from a culture where you do things for the good of all. They say that this really emerged a lot from rice farming, where collaboration was so essential for success in rice farming. Whereas, by the way, up this end, wheat farming doesn't require a lot of cooperation, apparently. You can do it all by yourself. Some would say on the left, actually, it's more like those who emerged from Greece, where individualism was triumphed at a young age with the Olympics and with stage performances, and Greek farmers are perfectly happy to put down their tools for a while and go off somewhere to then perform on the stage. But in Asia, so many thoughts are around what's good for the group. So in a meeting, if a person is silent, often that can be for collectivist reasons, because the person's respectful of the group and wouldn't speak up, wouldn't assume, wouldn't take that it's my right. In a classroom, many Asian classrooms are 30 children or more, and that the way of behaving is that you do not put your hand up and ask a question. If you're not following, you assume that's your problem. There's really not this thought of whether it's helpful to the group if you point out that you're not following. That's yours to work out. And you would not put your hand up and mention that you're not following, because you might drag the group down. Maybe everyone else is following. So in a collectivist mentality, you would not therefore say anything to the teacher. But in an individualist society, you're responsible for your learning, and you're responsible for doing whatever it takes to make sure you get your learning for all that you need to accomplish in life. So you would put a hand up and show that you aren't following, and even put some of the burden back on the teacher to help you to learn, because that's taking individual responsibility. It wouldn't occur to you that you might be dragging down the rest of the group, because that really hasn't been something that's been laid down in your culture. So these two very different behaviors can then have some interesting results, because someone who's from a collectivist society isn't used to that individualist behavior, might think, who's this blah blah interrupting person who somehow thinks she has the right to take up time here on what she wants to talk about. They wouldn't dream of doing it. But really, that's not the driver that was happening to the interrupting person.
Oh no, Phil, did we lose her? Phil, you're actually still muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
I think we've lost our speaker. I'm sure she's going to figure that out quickly, and she will reconnect. So do you want to go to some of the, I see that we've got 6 messages in the chat box.
We do. One of our listeners from Hungary mentions that there's a difference between Chinese and Japanese, and I certainly would like to ask Kathy about that. I'm going to send her an email offline to see if I could get to her to be reconnected.
Oh, to Kathy O'Brien.
Yes, to Kathy. So I'll give it to you, Laura, while I'm contacting her.
Okay, so I am going to look at the chat and see what else we have there as well. Who gets to speak first is one difference. Sheila Bentley said that. Sheila, do you want to expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, you know, when you travel, I think there are a number of things that happen even before anybody speaks that oftentimes we're unaware of. So in certain cultures, there are very strict protocols about who speaks first, who can speak and whom you can speak to, and then what you can speak about and whether you can disagree with someone. So, you know, it seems like there are a lot of things that go on even before we start to talk where if we don't know that it's inappropriate for me to speak to this person, you know, that person should speak to me first. You know, how do we know those things before we've even opened our mouths? And I've just have found that in traveling, there are so many of those that as Americans, we're completely oblivious because we think we can speak to anybody.
Well, how do you know that then, Sheila? I mean, how do you figure it out? I know that you're an international traveler, so how have you figured that out?
Well, sometimes people prepare you, you know, they tell you. But I remember one time in Bali, this young man that was showing us around said that he was not, because there's a caste system there, he was not allowed to talk to, he could not initiate conversation with his superiors, that his superiors had to initiate the conversation. Then he could respond to them, but he was not allowed to initiate. And in some cultures, it's women that cannot initiate the conversation. And in some cultures, you can't disagree with like in Japan, you can't disagree with management unless they've already decided that you could bring up a subject. So I'd like Kathy to answer those. How do you find out about those? Because nobody's even opened their mouths yet, and all these rules exist.
Oh, I love this one. Oh, can you all hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Did you lose me earlier?
We did lose you.
But we have you back now.
Yes, we don't know what went wrong, but fortunately I was able to jump onto Chris's laptop here, so if you're seeing his name under me, that's why. Okay. Boy, oh boy, Sheila, I wish I could give you the magic clue on this one. You know the usual stuff, which is find out as much as you can before the situation. Ask people, do your reading. You will find, this is a rather interesting thing I find with cultural studies. Cultural studies are so much done by anecdote. There are some good books. You'll see we've referred some of them at the back. And those who've studied them have tried to set up dimensions, frameworks, ways for thinking about culture. But you find once they've introduced whatever that is, the only way that we really grasp it is by them giving us examples. And it's really easy to diss those examples too, because you'll read only 2 examples, one from the Middle East and one from Chile, and you'll say, oh, this is no help to me. I'm not going to the Middle East or Chile, or no, I've been to the Middle East and it wasn't exactly that. So this is all very, very tough stuff. Let's think. What would I say? I would ask very open questions, Sheila. Wherever I could, just very curious questions about a behavior that surprised you or something you weren't sure of. I do more checking, checking on whether I perceived something properly. Mm-hmm. I'll think of an example. I was in Vietnam last week doing business, and even though I go there a lot and I think I know a bit about that culture, I was really reminded in this meeting with someone I hardly knew of how inexpressive listeners are there. That they will listen with the stillest of faces. And having come from a culture where we give a lot of visual clues and we make a lot of acknowledging sounds, and as we were saying earlier, sometimes we'll even interrupt or ask questions to help our own listening. This is a totally different approach. I'm speaking and this person is looking straight at me with an absolutely placid face, and I have no idea if she understands me, if my speed is right, if my English is at a level that she can grasp, if I need to change it or not. To me, I'm getting no clues. So one of the things I do is that I pause more often and ask an open question to see if I can get some feedback from that person that will then give me some information. Something like, are you familiar with this already? Would you like me to say a little bit more? What are your thoughts on this? To get them speaking a bit. I find in very traditional cultures, often they will very politely and very professionally repeat back what they just heard from you. Almost like a very good student. But it's a ritual. It's considered appropriate in a respectful situation to just repeat back. So you can do this, and you are thinking that, and you have done this before, and your company is about this. Really, the whole thing back. But at least in doing that, I do get a sense of what's been picked up, and that's helping me to gauge the way I behave going forward.
Kathy, if I can interrupt here, actually, it strikes me that this ties back to something that you had said previously. You talked about family and socialization. And as I'm sitting here listening to your examples, I'm also thinking, from what I know about listening and listening research, cultures don't listen differently, but cultures do culture differently. I'm not sure if that makes sense. So our listening behaviors are driven by the culture, but the cognitions perhaps are not different. And it also goes back to what you said about families, raise you with different rules, like in Boston, look at me while I'm listening to you, or while you're listening to me. And so it would depend upon how the family raised that individual within the culture as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Just say a little bit more about what you mean about the cognitions being different.
Oh, the cognition piece. So the way that I always approach listening is we have listening cognitions, and listening primarily is a cognitive process, which means it takes place in our brain, and we know if we understand something or not. But listening is perceived behaviorally by other people. So generally, the relationship and the way that we show listening is totally dependent upon our culture. So, for example, you were saying that, in the United States, you do the head nodding, which you're doing right now, and the facial expressions, you're doing that with me. But I'm thinking about that other person that you were just referring to that had, almost the plastic face, because culturally, you're not supposed to show anything on the face or necessarily even ask questions, because as you said, in those collectivistic cultures, it's the individual's responsibility to understand, and to ask a question could be disrespectful because then it assumes that the speaker didn't do his or her job.
Yes. Yeah. So then your question was also, what other effect does family or socialization within the family add on to that?
Yes, and because I had never thought about that before, but different families in, let's say, in Singapore could be raising children with different listening rules.
Sure. So my good friend is married to a Korean, and he's a twin, but he's the younger twin. So his brother is a couple minutes older than him. And so all of his life, the elder brother has held court while he stays silent, has been given the bigger piece of meat at dinner, is absolutely the leader. And it's obvious because he's the older one. I was observing, even with my own kids who are they're third culture kids, so they're growing up in Singapore, but they're not Singaporean, etc., and they go to international school. But still, my 15-year-old, when he feels like speaking, that's not always the time, the thing with 15-year-olds, but when he suddenly gets into a speaking mode and he wants to share something with me at dinner, he will completely dominate the conversation, talking about what he wants to say. And my 11-year-old will sit there completely silently and listen to him. And sometimes I will interrupt and say, hey, how about asking your brother a question or bringing him in? Or I'll ask a question or bring the younger brother in. But this was frustrating me a bit. And then I asked an English friend who grew up in a family of boys. He said, this is classic alpha male behavior. This is what happens. The alpha male does the talking. And we accept that. And your younger son is learning this, and he needs that in society. Please, someone else tell me, is this true? I don't know.
Kathy, we have a question from Juliana. I'm going to unmute her so she could ask her question. Go ahead, Juliana. Juliana, you're unmuted. You can ask your question.
Oh, it sounds like perhaps her microphone isn't working. So perhaps she could type in her question?
Okay, well, I have her question. Her question here. Juliana asks, do you believe that the culture of listening is affected by literate culture? Has listening become too naturalized And that is why cultures do not consciously teach it.
Wow.
Interesting.
I'd love to hear from those of you who teach in listening, because I think you'd have more to say about this. Would you say that listening has become too naturalized?
I would think it depends on what you mean by naturalized. I know, coming from the United States culture, I can say that our culture is very speaker focused and the speaker has the power. But in traveling to other cultures, for example, the first time I went to Finland, I did a keynote, and then, as is my custom, afterwards I asked for questions, and no one asked a question. And it wasn't until later that I learned that they wouldn't ask a question because that would be disrespectful to me. Whereas I felt like no questions was disrespectful to me. But they teach listening and again, I think that listening goes back to the cultural mores more than people are calling it listening. I don't know. This is fascinating, Kathy.
Awesome.
The piece I'd love to add to this, and Juliana, please, if you can't speak with your mic, but you want to type more, we'd love to hear it, is I would actually suggest that we're not consciously I think we are teaching it, but we don't yet know how to teach how to listen. As Laura said, listening is such a cognitive process. What we tend to do from a young age is teach certain behaviors that seem to indicate that the person is listening. When we're in primary school or even kindergarten, we're taught to be quiet. We're taught to sit still when someone is speaking to us. Behaviors might indicate that the person is speaking, but they don't necessarily direct what's going on in the person's mind. The person could be thinking about something totally different. But because we kind of can only measure what we can see, we work on those outward behaviors. We haven't yet figured out how to tell people what to do inside their heads. There's been some very interesting work on it. Laura, I'm thinking even about one of the very, very early articles, How to Listen, that talked about putting the wandering thoughts in your brain to work more on what you're listening to make yourself focus on it more so that you grasp more. But anyone else have any comments on that, on whether we really are able to teach listening?
I hate to be the only one that comments here, but that is actually my area of research study right now, and where I do my research and publications in is teaching the cognitions of listening and teaching the metacognitions of listening. I do believe that they can be taught. I think that people develop their own definitions of what it means to listen. So until they actually get instruction in it, they don't recognize what listening actually is. And I saw that Sheila had typed a little bit before that, a big challenge that we have is distinguishing between hearing and listening. I notice a lot of times with my students that even though I define hearing as just being the physiological process and listening as the making meaning or comprehending or understanding process, they actually think of it differently. So they think hearing is when you're really understanding something or making meaning, and listening is just the stuff that goes on naturally every day.
Mm-hmm. Shall we move on perhaps to another dimension and then see how those bear on each other?
Absolutely.
So we were talking about ethnic and national culture. The next one is family and socialization, but we've already touched on some of this. So I wonder if we might move on to the next one, but keep family and socialization in mind as well, folks. So as we talk about gender, we might wind up getting back to family and socialization, or culture, of course, as well. So many of you might be familiar with Deborah Tannen's article, Who Gets Heard and Why, written back more than 30 years ago. And yet it's still cited very often in gender studies, because she was really the first to pick apart how women speak differently than men and listen differently than men, and to begin to identify what some of those behaviors are. So we've all observed this on many levels. I really want to hear from the rest of you. How do women and men listen differently? And how has that awareness that you have affected what you do? When you are in a conversation or meeting with someone who's of a different gender, what do you do? How do you flex your behavior to get the most out of that conversation?
Oh, I don't know. I don't talk to a lot of men. I don't know. Oh, crap, did he unmute me?
Hi, I'm hearing you, but only just a bit soft.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I had no idea that I could be heard at all. I was just kind of
Okay. Who's this?
My name is Chandra. I'm in Virginia.
Great.
So in response to that question, interestingly, I don't talk to a lot of men. And I've noticed that my own self-perception, I would say within the past few years, is that the way I talk and listen has changed, because I talk almost exclusively to women.
And how has it changed?
I think that I'm more impatient when I listen to women. And I have no idea what this is all going to say about me, but I just get impatient when I'm listening to women a lot, I think, because I feel like we kind of go around the bend, so to speak. Like, we tell a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes. There's a lot of sort of side conversation, and I just find it distracting. And while they're talking, I'm thinking to myself, get to your point. What is your point? Maybe that's because I'm from the East Coast and it's all coming out of me now. But, Virginia is not, they don't really claim being East Coast. They're like mid-Eastern Atlantic, which is different and sort of Southern. But I listen impatiently to women.
So then, say we were in a conversation with you, what would we notice about that impatience? How does that play itself out in behavior?
I think I get a look on my face that kind of goes neutral, which is my signal that I do not want to respond to any of this because I don't want to encourage you to continue in this vein. I just want you to keep it moving so that I can get to, the mother lode here and understand what it is you're trying to say.
Okay. Very interesting. And while you're saying this, Chandra, I also see in the chat that someone, ZSG, was saying women focus on details in listening. ZSG, I wonder if you'd like to join in the conversation at all and tell us whether you have a similar experience to Chandra or if you're speaking about something different. ZSG, do you want to join us on this one?
I do not
see
ZSG anymore.
Okay, if you do, If you want to join in later, please do let us know. Okay, so someone else, yes?
This is Frank. I'd like to join in on that.
Hey, Frank.
Hey. Just to piggyback on what she said, I do find that, like, even in my own family, if I didn't talk to the women, I wouldn't know what's going on far away. Because the men don't talk, or it's like pulling teeth to get them to talk, because they're just more focused on getting to the point, or certain things that they didn't find relevant. Like, say, a bodily injury, they're like, well, I got over it, so I didn't even tell you about it. Whereas the women will tell me every little detail of every paper cut and every new neighbor that visits. And so I think it's just something that you just get used to, where if you're talking to women, you notice that they like a lot more detail, and so you just have to be prepared for that and be okay with it. And for men, vice versa, they don't give as much detail, and so sometimes you have to encourage them to give you more in order to get your answer. And so depending on business or personal, it can be frustrating, but depending on who you're talking to. But yeah, I do agree in general that I don't think one's bad or better. I just think depending on the context of what your goal is, one can be frustrating versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
Frank, I'm going to ask you to remember something.
Okay.
Frank and I did the Certified Listening Professional certification about 6 years ago, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember we had one exercise? We would all dial in together. This is a wonderful way to learn about listening. And Dick Halley, who was our professor, who really guided us in our learning, fantastic. On this call, Frank, you were dialed in from Canada, I think, right?
Yeah.
I was dialed in from Singapore. We had folks dialed in from many different places. Dick read out, gave us a map. We had to download this map ahead of time when I was looking at it with my pen, ready to follow. And he gave us a set of instructions to follow on this map to get to a spot. And as he gave the instructions and we followed, oh my goodness, I was so lost. I was really, when we finally got to the point where we should have been, I was in such a different place. Whereas Frank, do you remember, I'm sure it was Robert in California, who said, this was so easy. You just had to cut out a whole lot of junk that he was giving you and just listen for the main instruction. And I found it, no problem. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And what Robert was calling junk or, irrelevant information or whatever, indeed, I had become completely distracted by. I was trying to find the grassy knoll in the picture instead of focusing on the fact that he said turn left. And it was really fascinating to me. And remember, then identified, maybe some of you who are have much better ILA memories will help me with which model we were looking at, but it kind of zeroed in on whether we were content listeners or perhaps it was empathic listeners or emotional listeners.
I think you're talking about the Watson and Barker listening styles. So there's content and time and relational, and I always forget the fourth one because it's very much like goal-oriented.
Yeah, indeed, we might have defaulted to that now that I think of it. I think this wasn't necessarily focused around that, but we may have gone to those labels.
Action. Yes. Yeah, Sheila says action. Yes. Thank you, Sheila.
Yes. Yeah, I think Robert was very much an action and goal-oriented listener. So any comments on that from anyone?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that we look at the different gender listening and perceptions, and sometimes I know in my teaching as well, we talk about, well, these are generalizations, they may be stereotypes, but everybody you talk to, they fall into these areas. So it's almost like we generalize ourselves to what we consider the stereotypes are.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting, Bill. Yeah.
Yeah, and to bring in a couple of other chat items, Tina says, considering a more fluid notion of gender, I realize it really depends on the specific person, situation, or relationship. Whereas Juliana Leone says female listening behaviors are more focused on the process, or men on the purpose. So I think there's probably this combination of what we're looking for, or what our perceptions of genders are. That's what we look for, and that's what we assume is going to happen, instead of allowing people to just be the individuals they are.
Mm. Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So, folks, how does this play out in your work? Say you're in a meeting with men and women. What differences do you observe? Sheila, I'd love to hear from you because you've done so much work in the business world.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. I can give you a really good example just from a conversation I had with my daughter yesterday. She works in a company. She's a manager, and she had been asked to apply for to take over a position, and she wanted to know if she wanted to share some information about what she thought should be part of that position. And the person she was going to be talking to was a male, and but he is, sort of, how do I say this? Anyway, sometimes women have to couch what they say in different terms to a man than they do to a woman. So instead of saying to him, because he is in a superior position, instead of her calling him and saying it needs to be this, this, and this, I suggested that she worded as questions. Would it be possible, or do you think this might be something to consider in that content? Because he might respond to it differently. It might be okay for a man to call and say, we need to do this, this, and this. But for a female who is not on the same level to call and say, we need to do this and this, might be perceived as, bossy or, whatever, and just might not be as accepted. Her way of saying, if a woman said that as a man said that. And, I think we're getting away from some of that, but it's still very real. It's still very real, particularly when you have different ages communicating with each other. I get yes, ma'am all the time in the South. I get yes, ma'am to death. I felt like I was about 94 the other day. I got yes, ma'am so much. But anyway. Anyway, I do think, that there are some changes being made, but I still think that that it's sometimes more challenging for women to take leadership positions, because if you're too assertive, then it's like, oh, who does she think she is? But if you're not assertive enough, then you don't have the leadership skills. So I think we still kind of walk a fine line there.
I actually have a follow-up question on that one, Sheila, and it's the follow-up I think is probably a little bit more for Kathy here. But in terms of women in leadership, is that something that is prominent in Singapore, Thailand, Japan, China? Are women moving more into the leadership roles there?
Now that's such a really interesting question. Yeah. Coming from an American perspective, and I know only some of us on the call are, but I'll start with that one since you and I do come from it, Laura. We are kind of raised to believe that we have somehow gone further than other cultures. And the beautiful thing about living in other cultures is you find out that's not really the case. So, in fact, working women, for example, in this particular culture in Singapore are absolutely the norm. And women in positions of leadership are very common. However, I will add there's a big move here to get more women as board directors, as the directors of a company listed on the stock exchange. The percentage there is still very low. It's maybe just barely into double digits. Whereas in some other cultures, it's much, much, much higher. I will share, though, that I was talking the other day about going to China and doing some work on communication skills there. And I was speaking to an American who does live abroad. And right away, her response was, oh, wow, I bet what you do can help them so much there. They must have really appreciated that. And it was this very sort of paternal or superior thought. even from someone who's very kind and certainly wasn't intending to sound that way. But I had to remind her, I was coaching women who are partners, already partners, of one of the world's largest consulting firms, one of the top 3. These women are already seriously accomplished women who completely own the room. And I find in China, actually, that some of the gender differences that bother us in the US don't even exist there. It's really not an issue. So there's a whole lot of variety out there. And I'd encourage all of you to get yourselves dropped into another culture anytime you can and start to notice that. I think, do I see Jean-Francois on our list? Because Jean-Francois, you're in Europe. You might have a comment on examples of the cultures you're working with there.
Jean-Francois, you're still muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Let's say I'm in Switzerland, Geneva, and in Switzerland we have 4 languages, so different cultures are next door, and it's interesting to deal with that. So we don't really understand that there's a different mentality between these 4 cultures, and depending on where you are, also in the country, in Switzerland, you get to you don't know the one of the 4, because I'm in the West, I'm in Geneva, and when you there's another language, completely another language in the East that we don't know. We have some contact with people speaking like a German dialect from the north of Switzerland, and people speaking like an Italian dialect in the south. And all this mixture is at first a little bit disturbing, because you're in the same country, but you don't understand the mentality of the other. And it's also richness, because you get to know at least 2 other languages, every product that you can buy in the French part of Switzerland, where I live, Geneva. Every product has is labeled in at least 3 languages, so it's also at the same time rich and at the same time disturbing. So that's what I can say around this topic for now.
Thanks, Jean-Francois. So even as we're all speaking, I noticed that even when we try to speak about one piece of it, as Jean-Francois just said, it's also rich. It's impossible to take one layer all by itself. We could be in a situation where we're crossing gender and we could notice a difference, but is that necessarily a gender difference? Or is it a language difference, or cultural, or family upbringing, or socialization? It's quite hard to pick apart the pieces, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Shall we keep moving, Laura, or would you like to take a break, or what's best for the group?
Well, when I'm looking at the PowerPoint, I think we only have about 2 more items until we go to the discussion. So would you like to cover those items and then we'll break and come back for the discussion?
Sure.
Does that work for you? Okay.
Or we don't need to take a break if folks would, since we're doing a lot of discussing already. if folks would rather just continue through, I'm happy either way.
We'll take a 5-minute just so everybody can stand up.
Okay, great. All right, so folks, 2 more categories of layers I'd like to suggest. Context and expectations. So when you go into a listening situation, how much do your expectations of that situation or the context that you're in affect the way you listen? Sheila, I know, has done exercises in your own workshops where you get people to listen to directions and observe how well they listen, how much they get, whether some people get them better than others, what listening strategies are they using there. In a situation like that, how much are you affected by whether you are the student, the learner? Do you listen differently, perhaps? Or if you are the boss and someone who works for you is speaking to you, does the fact that you're the boss make you listen differently in that moment than if you go and listen to your boss? I will share, for example, that I notice I have an incredibly different listening style when I go to the doctor. When I'm with my doctor, I want to get hold of every single thing I hear, and I want to write it down because I'm fearful of forgetting it. And I want to get them to tell me every terminology so I can go away and Google it on my own later. And I want to double check what they're saying. I'm listening. You might say I'm even listening as a critical listener, checking, but wait a minute, what about what you told me last time? And how much of this is good? And at what point is it not good anymore? And how frequently do we need to check this again? And frankly, for my doctor, I might actually seem to be a bit of an aggressive listener, very much at that individualistic end of the spectrum, because I think in this one time I have you, I want so much to get everything. But if the doctor doesn't know that that's my intention, and that's why I'm being such a dogmatic listener, you could easily see the doctor taking offense, wondering if I'm challenging her expertise, wondering if I don't believe what's going on here, or taking up way too much of her time. How come this patient asks 1,000 questions? But then again, as I see it, this is looking after my health. This is doing the right thing by me. But I go and listen extremely differently when I'm with a client. So how does context affect the way that you listen? Give us some sharing, folks.
Oh, they're testing you, Kathy.
Okay, all right. Well, I've given you a medical example. I've given you some work examples. Think about yourself as boss, or yourself as speaking to a boss, or yourself speaking to, say, a client or an external party. How about listening to family members? Do you go in with expectations? He always goes on and on and on. And do you tune out, perhaps, for some of it? Or do you go in with habits from the way you two have always listened to each other? How do you listen to a friend? I was doing an interesting workshop with business people and was working on listening strategies, and someone asked this question of, what do you do when a person just goes on and on and on and on and is, giving you way too much and won't stop, and it's just talking. And we had to pause at that moment and ask, well, what was your intention here? If you're with this person, from the sounds of it, you sound like you're not really trying to listen to this person, that you're not comfortable with what's going on in this encounter. So are you really listening? Or is this context somewhere where you're calling it listening, but you're not really listening at all? In fact, she was sort of asking, how do I cut them off, make them not go on for so long? Which wouldn't normally be called a listening strategy. So there are maybe a few examples of context and also the expectations that we bring into a conversation. Why don't we leave that layer? We may find ourselves touching on it again in the discussion about others. And why don't we go to one more?
Kathy, I actually do have 2 comments from people.
Good.
Juliana says the context is determinant in the listening and the authority of the speaker. In Colombia, South America, listening in the rural context is very different from listening in the city, which I think brings in some of the authority of the speaker that you were referencing prior to that as well. And then on a much more personal basis, Kathy G says, I listen to my grandson so he feels heard and that he matters. Isn't that nice?
Yeah. So Kathy G, I'm wondering if I'm also reading into this, that to you, it's not so much the content or even his style, that you've gone into that listening situation with an intention of validating him. And because of that, you have a particular perhaps tolerance or love even that you're bringing into it that guides all the rest of your behavior. Love to hear more from you, typing or speaking if you'd like to on that one. Anyone else on context and expectations, or shall we move to one more layer and then talk about them all together?
I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay. So one more I thought I'd toss out is your perception of yourself in context. So I mentioned one example a moment ago, which is when you're the subordinate, say, in business or in a job. Do you have to send more listening skills because it's the boss speaking, the authority is speaking, so you have to show that you're listening? So do you have to send those signals very deliberately? Now, by the way, those signals will be different again from culture to culture. So my signals might be that eye contact and nodding and acknowledging sounds, as I said. But for another person, those listening signals might very much be stillness and silence and a placid face. And I'd love to hear about other behaviors that any of you might have if you're, say, in a situation like that. Or how about something like familiarity? I will share that when I go into a new culture, and in my work I do this all the time. I was in Indonesia a few days ago. I mentioned I was in Vietnam the week before that. When I'm in a different culture, I'm very attentive to how familiar I am with the way things are done there, with what they're like. Thinking about what Sheila was saying earlier on in our call about entering a new culture, what do you do? I find I go on sort of hyper listening in a new culture. I'm really paying attention to the signs, picking up much more because I'm not familiar. I can't get into any grooves yet. There is no default behavior for me. So if you were to meet me for the first time in a foreign culture, you'd probably find me a little bit more formal. There'd be a lot more pausing. I would probably over-articulate because one of the easiest ways to be understood when you're crossing culture is to really fully pronounce your words. I would probably be more deferential in my gestures. For example, when I go to Muslim cultures, I make sure I keep my body language much closer. I don't make the assumption of reaching a hand out to shake hands even, for example, because a man might not be comfortable shaking my hand and I wouldn't want to put him in an awkward position. So a lot of things become restrained, and in some ways I find that restraint makes my listening different because I am more of an physically active listener. So share with me some examples for yourselves. When you see yourself in a context, how does that change the way you listen?
Oh, Sheila's waving. Phil, could you unmute her?
I think a lot of it, again, depends on your purpose. Why are you in that culture? What do you hope to get out of it? But, I think the one thing that I try to take with me when I'm in different cultures is that you can overcome a lot of differences if you're interested in their culture, if you're interested in what they have to say. And as Americans, we have a tendency to think they want to hear everything about us, that, everybody wants to hear what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. But if you take as much interest in their culture and, your willingness to make the effort to listen to them and to ask their, questions of them and that sort of thing. And, to be polite rather than assuming that you should be the one doing the talking and they should be the ones doing the listening. I just think, that's the trump card. No matter what the situation, no matter what the differences are, if we both came to it with the sense of, I really want to hear what this other person has to say, rather than I really want them to hear what I have to say, that, we can get past some of those differences.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that, Sheila. I love that so much.
That makes sense. And we actually have a few chats coming in
Yes.
very quickly. So let me go back to that. I think this was Chandra from Virginia said, for me, every relationship has its own culture, so I listen according to the culture of my relationship with that person, which is a very interesting way to look at that. Juliana says it all depends on the purpose of the conversation. So part of the context is the purpose. So what is the purpose? And the purpose would help determine how I listened. Tina says, when I am facilitating a listening workshop, I intend to listen more deeply and globally while I am speaking, so that I am listening and speaking from a listening intention and modeling listening. Kathy thinks something's a good point. I think these are all good points, so I'm going to assume that's what you meant too. And Anu says, thank you for the fascinating discussion. Would love to stay, but unfortunately I have to leave now. I'm looking forward to meeting you all in Dublin. So we are looking forward to meeting Anu as well.
Fantastic.
I think,
oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, Kathy, I think at this point, maybe Phil, if we take everybody off mute, because I think we have enough people that we could manage that and move into the discussion.
Juliana, your point about the purpose, I am so happy you mentioned this. I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity in Dublin to do a workshop, and the model we'll be looking at in that workshop is totally about the pieces of intention and attention. So it's very much what you're saying. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at what is your intention going into the listening. What you called it purpose. Why are you doing this in the first place? And then you simply have to ask yourself, well, what are the attentive behaviors I have? Whether it's physical attentiveness, mental attentiveness, situational attentiveness, making sure I manage the environment so that I can listen well. So if you join us in Dublin, Juliana, I look forward to talking more about that. So Laura, perhaps we could flip to the discussion slide for a moment.
Sure.
And just look at 3 ways that I thought we might talk about all of this. Laura, would you like me to throw them up as something to think about and take a 5-minute break, or how should we play?
Yes, I think well, actually, what are your thoughts on that, Kathy? Because I know we have to get you out in about 15 minutes. So perhaps we should stay on?
Is everyone okay staying on for another 15 minutes? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay, why don't we do that then? So
okay.
We've had some wonderful answers to these questions already, but also some of you haven't spoken, and maybe we haven't given a long enough pause to let some of you come in, and we need to respect your listening style more. Would really love to hear, what are the kind of clues you pick up? How can we pick up more clues? And what behavioral adjustments have you made in your listening that have helped you to be a better listener, particularly across boundaries?
I think Jenny Grau had something to share.
Okay. Sorry, I was trying to read and type and listen. So the boundaries I was thinking about were actually the boundaries you had mentioned earlier, and it was your comments about giving longer pauses so that others can step in. I thought very interesting. And I was reticent to step in a second time because I was the first person to step in the first time you asked for an example. So I'm monitoring my speaking and my listening, realizing we're on a very cross-cultural platform right now and thinking, should I be doing more listening? And what is my role in this group? It's a participant. I'm not a facilitator, but what is my relationship to you, Kathy? And we're friends and colleagues. And so how long should I let it sit out there with no one saying anything? And will that seem disrespectful to you? And, so many listening, speaking, pacing, timing questions. And I'm not facilitating the call, so it's really not my problem. I could just sit back and just sort of take it all in. But, I think, as you say, it's impossible to separate layers of relationship and of context and of role and of culture. And I share at least a East Coast North American culture with you. So, when I'm looking for clues, I sometimes watch what other people do. Sometimes I take risks and make mistakes and ask for forgiveness.
Yeah, I like that one. Thanks, Jenny. Jenny, I don't know if you remember, but the first time we met, we were in an ILA workshop with our lovely Japanese colleague, the gentleman. I've forgotten his name, but you might remember, Jenny, he was specifically talking about how Japanese listen differently from other cultures. And I remember you pulling him aside and asking him some very specific questions because you wanted to make sure you could codify what you were hearing from him. And it really struck me.
I'm glad you remember that. I remember the session. I don't remember the questions.
It'll come to me later. I'll tell you in time.
Okay.
Juliana says, my English is not very good, and I make an effort to understand the purpose of the conversation.
Yeah, Juliana, if you'd like even to type any more about that, what do you do to understand the purpose?
She did. Just the environment, the purpose, the context is very important. And here in my classes, for example, we have cultural diversity and therefore different ways of listening.
Wonderful.
I'd like to know more about that too, Juliana.
Yeah. More comments.
I think I hear her typing.
Michael, did I just see you unmute?
I didn't know.
Okay.
If I could, I wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Okay. I kind of want to ask a question of how do we deal with the context of our listening and our communication when the predominant context is pain or woundedness. Like, how do we deal with the barriers there? How do we try to reshape the context in which we're dealing with or listening to or being heard by a person or people when the predominant historical context of that situation is pain?
I want to make sure I understand what you're asking, Juliana. So, do you mean the context of the relationship overall? Or are you suggesting more that you might be in a relationship that has perhaps a very positive, supportive underpinning, but the discussion itself is about pain?
Let me restate it and try to clarify. So I'm thinking of it on two levels. Let me take the group context first. So in the United States, the historical relationships on a group level between different cultures. So say, for example, the historically majority culture of Caucasians or whites versus any other culture, Native Americans, African Americans, Asians, whatever. In many instances, let's say African Americans, which is what I am. So in many of those instances, when you're trying to have group discussions, or even when you're trying to have a conversation one-on-one with somebody, the dominant historical sort of way or context in which those groups relate to each other involves a lot of trauma and a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak. So sometimes I think listening is very hard in those contexts. And then if you bring it down to a one-on-one relationship, something that I'm finding a lot of parents are experiencing is very rough relationships with their children, either young adult children or teenagers once they hit those teen years. And listening also becomes, the context becomes very difficult for listening to happen.
Wow, this is so thoughtful. I'm sorry, can you tell me your name?
Chandra.
Oh, it's Chandra again. Sorry, Chandra. Okay.
Yes, that's okay.
Chandra, I'm really pausing because what you've said deserves so much thought. And I'm not an academic studying this, so I don't have any particular academic work to share with you, but this moment would be a call out to my friends who are doing more academic work.
Actually, what I would prefer to do is go to Michael or Tom if they would be willing to share. I see Michael smiling there, because this is actually their life work, and this is what they do, not from an academic perspective, but from a practical practitioner perspective. So Michael or Tom, would you like to address Chandra's question?
Well, we can start. In addition to Tom being on here, my colleague Abigail Turner is also on, and she is now our colleague too.
Uh-huh.
And so she might be able to speak as well. So we just want to include her if she would like to. But the context in which we listen to people every day is pain. It's people who are, this may be the pain of loss, or the pain of loneliness, or the pain of lack of self-esteem, the pain of abuse. We could go on, and it is really about giving everyone the chance or the opportunity to say whatever they need to say without judging them, without trying to fix them, simply allowing them to tell their story. And that is extremely significant. So I think the way we all approach everyone, and not just those we're quote unquote working with, but even people in our personal lives as much as possible, is that everyone has a story to tell, and every story is significant. And there are times, we talked earlier, heard earlier about that sometimes some people, it gets hard. It's difficult to listen to some people. Absolutely. But what we try to do is show them that their story has significance, and just continue to affirm that in people, because so many people are just not heard.
And this is Abby. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you, Abby.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Michael and Tom's colleague, as Michael mentioned. And I would just add, this was brought up earlier. And I think, Chandra, we can probably all relate to what you're describing here. Painful situations where there's hurt. I'm white, so I don't have the same history that you're describing with, of course, the tragic long-term abuse of African Americans. But at the same time, I think when when you're going into a situation where there's conversation surrounding that, my experience has been that we tend to be pretty ignorant about how we're coming across. And many people would be horrified if they knew how they were coming across, whether we're talking about race or gender or any issue. And so I think graciously pointing out to someone how they're coming across can really move mountains, so to speak. And I also think just asking open-ended questions, that was something that was mentioned before. Asking questions to help gain understanding, because sometimes we do just completely misunderstand what someone is saying.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Abigail.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, you also mentioned that Tom is on the call with us. Tom, contributions?
Sorry, I've been in and out because I had 4 kids were trying to get to bed. But
thank you for your in moments.
I think one of the things I would add to what Michael has shared is I think one of the universal truths that we all, at some point in our lives, are going to experience some form of grief. And it's the one common human experience that actually should draw us all together. And we talk about how grief can take on many different, there's many different things relating to grief. It could be a loss of a loved one, but it could be a loss of identity, loss of a job. And so again, those types of experiences are not unique. They actually are very human, that we all are going to go through at one time or another in our lives. So it doesn't matter what age you are, what race you are, what religion you are. That's just a common human experience.
So would the 3 of you share a little more for Chandra on the strategies you do employ to send that message of validation to the person who's coming from a context of pain?
We had a recent experience with an African-American couple, using that context, who were from Ferguson, Missouri, which for anyone in the United States would understand that is a very painful context of shooting and killing of young African Americans. And their father and the mother, who they were from there, but it was not someone in their family who died, but they have a young adult son with whom they were driving across country recently, and they took turns driving. When their young son got behind the driver's seat, he immediately took his wallet out of his pocket and put it on the dashboard. And his father asked him, "Why did you do that?" And he said, with much pain in his own voice and emotion, that because I am one of the young men who they are killing. If we are stopped, if I am seen reaching into my pocket for my wallet, it will be perceived that I'm reaching for a gun. And I don't want that to happen. So I and my friends put our wallets on the dashboard every time we get in the car. And so, we heard a story of a young man who was in that kind of pain and that fear that just accompanies who he is by virtue of his race and his age and his gender, as well as a father and a mother who, recounting the story, who, the pain of knowing that they actually have 3 sons, and all 3 sons are in that situation, and that they as parents found that to be very difficult. What they told us was that they appreciated that we didn't try to interrupt their story, We didn't try to say, oh yeah, we understood, because we don't understand it, because we as Caucasians don't experience that as they do. It's a matter of affirming and acknowledging that their story is real, even if it's not our story, that their story matters because it is real. So that's, I don't know, that's part of the answer, I hope. And I think it's not dismissing someone's story who is in pain, even if it's not our story. It's acknowledging that it's real and it's theirs. So that's part of the answer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's not our job to tell somebody if their story is right or wrong. It's our job to listen.
And one of the things that I can say for Michael and Tom, because they were webinar guests in a past webinar, they do an incredible job of holding time. So not speaking or responding to what was just said, but being empathic in that moment. And so I would suggest that sometimes it's the stillness that you have that can be really profound.
Mm.
Here in the United States, one of our heroes was the late Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And today, Michael and I went to the post office because in America right now, they're celebrating his legacy with postage stamps. And there are a lot of times where his work will come up in comparison to our mission. And he also was a trained pastor himself. So we have that connection as well. But one of the stories we love to tell is about how Fred, he had this way of whoever he was talking with, whether it was somebody on the telephone or somebody through email or, through his program, he was able to make that person who he was talking to feel as if they were the most important person in his life at that moment. And what a gift, and something we can all work on.
Chandra.
Yes.
You wanted to comment.
I really, I'm just soaking all of that in, like every single solitary word. And I so appreciate each of you and all of you taking the time to give me some really substantive things to think about, because one of the reasons I'm on this call is that I'm interested in working with African American women and families through trauma, but by listening, starting some like peer support listening groups and things of that nature, because there's just a lot of turmoil and there are a lot of things going on, and people just really need an ear. They just need help. So I wanted to try to see if I could get information about, how to even start to go about this. And I thought about, of course, my own personal context. I have 2 young adult sons. The youngest is about to be 22. And there are some things in our historical relationship that have been painful. But one of those things has to do with the encroachment of the outside culture on us. And it has exactly to do what the gentleman just spoke about with the African-American couple from Ferguson. So African-American women and family and parents raising young men it's a tough place to be at the moment, because you're trying to deal with the person that's in front of you, but you're also dealing with them, which means everything that you do concerning them, how you listen to them, how you speak to them. Because I'll give you an example. One of the things that my son takes issue with me with when we have conversation is that he feels like I'm sort of half listening to him because I'm anticipating what he's going to say. and I'm putting a lot of like fear into our interactions, and that bothers him. So, you know, if he starts talking about he went somewhere, like I jump in and I start saying, well, did such and such happen? Was so and so there? Did anybody do this? He's like, wait, I'm not even done talking yet. I wasn't even there yet. And so it really, really affects everything. And I'm trying to get some tools for myself and others to help us get better.
One of the things that most people do is they try to anticipate the their response before someone has finished speaking. And it's so important not to do that, but it's hard, and that's why so many people do it. And so it's partially, you know, practicing not trying to respond, but simply listening until someone is finished. It takes work. It takes work.
Yes.
And I need to just take one moment to step out. My doorbell is ringing. My wife is locked out, and I need to go.
Oh, yes, go do that. That's for sure. And to build on what he was saying, Chandra, often, actually, when I want to respond, but I know that it's not appropriate for me to respond because I should still be listening, I bite my tongue. And so that pain, you know, on the tip of my tongue that I'm biting, at least keeps my mouth shut and allows the other to continue speaking too.
I'm gonna have to try that.
I see. Yes, definitely. I see Juliana has another comment. It is not only the culture of each country, but precisely the economic political situation, which you tell is not far from the other realities in Latin America, for example. Here in Colombia, the pain of internal war, how to ward off the victims, the experiences of pain, of difficulty, of diversity, of migration, and of not understanding the language. Can it be heard beyond language? Wow. That's amazing. And then Tina added, one of my teachers had a saying that I remind myself of: change ambition to curiosity. I like that. Wow. Change ambition to curiosity. Kathy, I'm mindful that we're going to be losing you soon because you need to go to another engagement because it's the morning for you while it's the evening for me here. So would you like to speak a little bit about the resources that we have for people and the fact that if they would like a copy of this PowerPoint, then they can get that from you?
Yes, absolutely. So let's, you can see on the screen right now my email address. If you take it down, take a quick photo of the screen or write it down. And if you just drop me a quick email, I'll be very happy to share these slides and any other resources. If you mention the topic that particularly interested you, I'll share anything I've got. And I know my colleagues are very generous, so we'll point you in whatever direction we can. Perhaps just quickly, if we go to the next slide, Laura. A few for you to think about, whether you take these slides or not, but if you take these slides, it'll be easier for you to refer. Hofstede, the researcher I mentioned earlier, his research was done way back in the 1960s in business, so one could say, well, perhaps some of the dynamics that are true in business today were not present then, and that is definitely worth thinking about as you look at his research. However, interestingly, other cultural researchers today still often refer back to the dimensions that he introduced. So if we go to the next one, which is House, Robert House, a Wharton professor. You can see this GLOBE project, which is a very interesting center of excellence for studying communications. And House himself even took some of Hofstede's dimensions and retested them and found some very interesting correlations. So GLOBE project is more recent and also fascinating stuff. You've got a website there. And then a third I like to cite is Erin Meyer. who's a professor at INSEAD in France. She's written a pretty recent book called The Culture Map. She's got something more like 8 dimensions in her way of, her framework for looking at culture. She's also got very accessible videos on the topic. She was interviewed by Farid Zakaria, for example, on CNN about this. So do have a look at Erin Meyer. She makes this work really very accessible. A bunch of articles here. This one you'll want to get the PowerPoint from me to follow all of them, but you will notice in particular our beloved Laura Janusik, mentioned many times here in her work. Laura has done so much work in this area. I really encourage you to have a look. And you'll see there's another page of the research. Another colleague there, Corinna Jansen in the Netherlands. I love this blog post of hers that really sums up a lot of great strategies for listening. And Ralph Nichols, who's considered to be the father of the listening study, whose Harvard Business Review article way back in 1957 is still very useful. Final thoughts. Folks, Nichols said the most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them. So whatever perspective you've brought into this conversation today, whatever moments in today's conversation that have touched you or helped you or given you a new way to think about it, take those. Just take them and run with them. Come back to us and tell us where your running took you and what new discoveries you made. And please contribute to this wonderful and very dynamic body of knowledge that we're all sharing. I encourage all of you to become a member of the ILA and join us in Dublin. If we can go to the next slide, the convention is 20th to 23rd of June. I forgot to mention in the beginning when Laura and Phil were saying it, I'm also a life member of ILA because it is absolutely something I want to be affiliated with for my life. So come and have a first taste of us in Dublin, or join us now even before so that you get access to all the resources on the ILA website, which by the way is listen.org. Very easy to remember.
Terrific.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Laura, back to you.
Kathy, thank you so much. It was wonderful to spend time with you this evening, and wonderful to spend time with all of the other listeners who have been on the call as well. I second what you've said about Dublin. I am so looking forward to seeing people face to face and being able to listen face to face as well. But until we can do that, our webinars seem to suffice. So thank you very much for being here tonight, folks. And Phil, I think that you can help people understand better how to get out.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you all. This has been a very stimulating, very wonderful discussion. And we hope that we do see many of you in Dublin. To end the meeting for yourself, all you need to do is go on the bottom bar on the right-hand side. Some of you will have that on the end. Just click on End Meeting. And on that note, thank you, and we hope to see you in Dublin, and we also hope to see you in our next webinar.
Perfect.
Thank you, Phil. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.